On the morning of April 23, 1945, Oberst Friedrich Steiner stood in the ruins of a factory outside Torgau, Germany, watching columns of smoke rise from positions his forces had held just 48 hours earlier. The air carried the metallic scent of spent ammunition and the acrid bite of burning rubber, while the distant thunder of artillery rolled across the Elbe River valley like an approaching storm. His adjutant, Hauptmann Werner Vogel, handed him a pair of field glasses and pointed toward the western approach roads, where the lead elements of the American advance were visible through the morning haze. Everything in Steiner's training, everything the German High Command had told him about the enemy forces, everything he thought he understood about this conflict, was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Steiner would witness over the next 72 hours would not merely change his tactical assessment of the enemy. It would shatter fundamental assumptions that had been built into the very foundation of German military doctrine, forcing him to confront a truth that ideology had forbidden him to see. That courage, skill, and determination recognized no boundaries of race or color, and that the men advancing toward his position with such devastating effectiveness were about to rewrite everything he believed about warfare and humanity itself. The factory complex where Steiner had established his command post had once produced ball bearings for the German industrial machine, its assembly lines turning out millions of precision components for aircraft engines, tank transmissions, and artillery mechanisms. Now those same assembly lines lay twisted and silent, the machinery stripped away months earlier and relocated to underground facilities in the Harz Mountains. What remained were empty halls with shattered windows, concrete walls pockmarked by previous engagements, and a labyrinth of basement storage rooms that offered some protection from the constant aerial observation that had become the hallmark of Allied operations. Steiner had approximately 800 men under his command, a patchwork force cobbled together from the remnants of 3 different divisions that had been ground down during the fighting retreat across central Germany. They were equipped with a mixture of weapons that told the story of the German war effort's deterioration. Some carried the reliable Karabiner 98 rifles that had served German forces since the previous conflict. Others held the newer Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifles, and an unfortunate few made do with captured Soviet weapons or obsolete French rifles from stockpiles that dated back to 1940. Hauptmann Vogel was 26 years old, a former mathematics teacher from Hamburg, who had been commissioned in 1942 after completing officer training at the academy in Dresden. He had fought in the Eastern campaigns, survived the encirclement at Cherkasy, and carried with him the weary cynicism of a man who had seen too many strategic retreats disguised as tactical redeployments. As he stood beside Steiner that morning, he consulted a leather-bound notebook where he maintained meticulous records of their unit's status, his handwriting cramped and precise despite the shortage of quality paper. According to his calculations, they had ammunition for perhaps 3 days of sustained engagement, medical supplies for treating no more than 50 serious casualties, and rations that would last a week if supplemented by whatever could be scavenged from the surrounding countryside. The fuel situation was even more dire. Their motorized vehicles, a collection of trucks and half-tracks that had somehow survived the Allied air superiority, had enough diesel and gasoline for perhaps 30 kilometers of movement, after which they would become nothing more than expensive roadblocks. The intelligence reports that had reached Steiner's headquarters over the previous week had been fragmentary and often contradictory, filtered through a chain of command that was increasingly chaotic as the Reich's administrative structures collapsed under the weight of simultaneous advances from east and west. What he did know was that American forces had crossed the Rhine River in early March, that they had broken through the Ruhr pocket, and that they were now racing eastward with a speed that German planners had considered impossible. The tactical manuals Steiner had studied at the War College in Munich had taught him to expect measured, methodical advances from Western armies, characterized by overwhelming artillery preparation, followed by cautious infantry movements supported by armor. The reality of American operations in 1945 bore no resemblance to those outdated assumptions. entire army groups moved with the fluidity of cavalry raids, bypassing strong points, exploiting gaps, and maintaining a tempo of operations that left defending forces constantly off balance and unable to establish coherent defensive lines. What the intelligence reports had not mentioned, what Steiner had no way of anticipating, was the composition of the forces now approaching his position. The units advancing along the Torgau axis included elements of the United States 12th Army Group, and among those elements were soldiers whose presence in frontline combat roles would have seemed impossible to German military planners just months earlier. The 761st Tank Battalion, nicknamed the Black Panthers, had been activated in April 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, as one of the first armored units composed entirely of African-American enlisted men, led initially by white officers, but increasingly by black officers who had fought for the opportunity to lead men in combat. The battalion's shoulder patch displayed a black panther, fierce and unyielding, set against a white background with the motto, "Come out fighting," emblazoned below. By the spring of 1945, these men had already proven themselves in the campaigns across France and Germany, but their most significant impact was yet to come. The morning of April 23rd brought with it a peculiar clarity of atmosphere, the kind of day when visibility extended for kilometers across the gently rolling terrain of the Elbe River Valley. Steiner stood on what remained of the factory's administrative building, a reinforced concrete structure whose upper floors had been reduced to rubble by previous bombardment, but whose ground level still provided a serviceable observation post. Through his field glasses, he could see the leading edge of the American advance, a line of armored vehicles that moved with confident precision along the main highway from Leipzig. The tanks were M4 Shermans. He recognized them from the intelligence briefings and from encounters during previous engagements. Each Sherman weighed approximately 30 tons, was powered by a 9-cylinder radial engine producing 400 horsepower, and mounted a 75mm main gun that could penetrate 89mm of armor at 500 meters. The Americans had produced approximately 50,000 of these vehicles during the conflict, a number so vast that Steiner struggled to comprehend the industrial capacity it represented. German tank production, by contrast, had never exceeded 2,000 vehicles in a single year, and by 1945 had effectively ceased as factories were either destroyed by aerial bombardment or overrun by advancing forces. But what caught Steiner's attention that morning was not the tanks themselves, impressive though their numbers were. It was the men who commanded them. As the lead vehicles approached to within 1,000 meters of the factory complex, details became visible that made him lower his field glasses and look again. Uncertain whether the distance was creating optical illusions or whether he was actually seeing what appeared to be black soldiers in the turrets of the Shermans, moving with the practiced efficiency of experienced tank commanders, he raised the glasses again, adjusting the focus with fingers that had begun to tremble slightly. There was no mistake. The tank commanders scanning the approaches to the factory through their binoculars, the loaders visible in the open hatches, the crew members communicating with hand signals between vehicles, were African-American soldiers, and they were operating with a level of tactical competence that contradicted everything German propaganda had claimed about the capabilities of non-white soldiers. Vogel noticed his commander's reaction and requested the field glasses. After several moments of observation, he lowered them and spoke quietly, his voice carrying a note of confusion that bordered on disbelief. Steiner asked what he was seeing, and Vogel responded that the American forces included black soldiers in combat roles, operating armor and apparently leading the advance. The two officers exchanged glances that communicated more than words could express. The racial theories that had been woven into German military and political doctrine for years had insisted that such soldiers would be inferior fighters, lacking the discipline and courage for frontline combat. Yet here they were, conducting an armored advance with textbook precision, their formations spacing correct, their supporting infantry positioned properly, their reconnaissance elements probing forward to identify defensive positions before committing the main force. The initial contact came at 1000 hours, when American reconnaissance patrols reached the outer perimeter of the factory complex. These were not the cautious, probing movements that Steiner had expected. Instead, the Americans advanced with the confidence born of overwhelming superiority, using a combination of fire and maneuver that kept defending forces constantly reacting rather than executing planned defensive sequences. The first exchange of fire lasted less than 10 minutes before the American forces withdrew, having accomplished their objective of locating German positions and assessing defensive strength. Steiner understood immediately that this was not a withdrawal born of casualties or unsuccessful engagement. It was a tactical pullback designed to allow for the positioning of heavier weapons and the coordination of a more substantial effort. What followed over the next 2 hours was a demonstration of combined arms warfare that Steiner would later describe as among the most professionally executed operations he had witnessed during his entire military career. American artillery, brought forward with remarkable speed, began a systematic bombardment of German positions that was noteworthy not for its intensity, but for its precision. Rather than the massive, indiscriminate barrages that characterized Soviet artillery tactics, the American fire was selective and accurate, targeting specific buildings, specific strong points, specific avenues of approach. Between artillery strikes, American aircraft appeared overhead, not the heavy bombers that had reduced German cities to rubble, but tactical fighter bombers that delivered ordnance with surgical precision before climbing back into the morning sky. The coordination between ground forces, artillery, and air support was seamless, the kind of integration that required extensive training, sophisticated communications equipment, and a level of tactical doctrine that went far beyond simple firepower superiority. And throughout all of this, Steiner could see through his field glasses that many of the American soldiers directing operations, coordinating movements, and executing tactical decisions were black men who moved with the assurance of veterans who had done this many times before. There was a tank commander, visible in the turret of his Sherman as he directed fire against a German machine gun position, who couldn't have been more than 25 years old, but who demonstrated the calm competence of a much more experienced soldier. There was an infantry squad leader who coordinated his men's advance across open ground with hand signals and whistle commands, keeping his unit spread properly while maintaining momentum. There was an artillery observer who sat calmly in an exposed position, binoculars trained on the factory complex, calling down fire corrections with the practiced ease of someone who trusted absolutely in his own abilities and the capabilities of his supporting fires. Sergeant First Class Robert Cartwright commanded the lead tank in the advance toward Torgau, a Sherman that his crew had named Eleanor's Revenge after Cartwright's mother, who had worked double shifts in a Detroit defense plant while raising 5 children alone after Cartwright's father had been refused promotion at the same factory due to his race. Cartwright was 32 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands scarred from years of working as an automotive mechanic before the conflict. He had enlisted in 1942, survived the brutal training regimen at Fort Hood, Texas, where black tankers were segregated into separate facilities and often denied access to the same equipment and resources as white units, and had proven himself in combat from Normandy to the Rhine. His crew consisted of 4 other men, each of whom he had trained personally, each of whom he trusted with his life, and each of whom shared his determination to prove that black soldiers could fight as well as any troops in the American military. The gunner, Corporal James Mitchell, was a former college student from Chicago who had left Howard University after 2 years when his family could no longer afford tuition. He could calculate range and deflection faster than most men could read the numbers off a slide rule, and his accuracy with the 75mm main gun had made Eleanor's Revenge one of the most effective vehicles in the battalion. The loader, Private First Class David Washington, was a dock worker from New Orleans who could manhandle 75mm shells with a speed that seemed impossible given their weight of approximately 15 pounds each. The driver, Corporal Thomas Jenkins, had grown up on a farm in Mississippi and possessed an intuitive understanding of terrain and vehicle mechanics that made him invaluable for navigating the bomb-cratered roads and muddy fields of central Germany. The assistant driver and bow gunner, Private Isaac Coleman, was the youngest member of the crew at 19, a high school athlete from Philadelphia who had joined the military the day after graduation. determined to serve his country despite the obstacles placed in front of black volunteers. As Cartwright guided his tank toward the factory complex, he was acutely aware of the historical significance of what they were doing. African American soldiers had fought in every American conflict since the Revolutionary War, but always in segregated units, always under white command, and always while facing discrimination that questioned their courage, their competence, and their fundamental humanity. The 761st Tank Battalion had been created in part as a test of whether black soldiers could handle the complex technical and tactical demands of armored warfare. Every engagement, every advance, every moment of combat was not just about defeating the German forces. It was about proving that skin color had no relationship to courage, that ability knew no racial boundaries, and that American democracy's claims about equality and opportunity were either universal truths or empty words. The propaganda that German forces had been exposed to regarding African American soldiers was a mixture of racist caricature and deliberate misinformation, designed to boost morale by depicting enemy forces as inferior. Leaflets distributed to German units claimed that black American soldiers were poorly trained, equipped with substandard weapons, and lacking the intelligence for modern warfare. Officers had been told that any American units with significant numbers of black soldiers would be easy to defeat, that they would panic under fire, that they would break and run at the first sign of serious resistance. These claims had been repeated so often, through so many channels, that they had acquired the weight of established fact among German military personnel who had no direct experience to contradict them. The reality that Steiner now faced was so completely at odds with these expectations that it created a cognitive dissonance he struggled to process. The American forces conducting the assault on his positions were not the disorganized, poorly led rabble that propaganda had described. They were professionals executing a carefully planned operation with skill that matched or exceeded that of the best German units he had encountered. The black soldiers, he observed, were not fighting in some secondary support role. They were leading the assault, commanding tanks, directing infantry, and making tactical decisions with a competence that forced him to question everything he had been told about racial hierarchies and military capability. Private First Class Coleman, serving as assistant driver in Cartwright's tank, had his own thoughts about the engagement unfolding around him. As he peered through the periscope that gave him limited visibility from his position in the front hull, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He remembered the segregated training facilities at Fort Hood, where black soldiers had been housed in inferior barracks, denied access to base amenities that white soldiers took for granted, and subjected to a training regimen that seemed designed more to prove they couldn't succeed than to prepare them for combat. He remembered the constant scrutiny from officers who seemed to expect failure, who questioned every decision, who maintained a level of oversight that white units never experienced. He remembered the letters from home, from his mother who worked as a domestic servant in Philadelphia, from his younger sister who was attending a segregated school in a building that lacked proper heating, from his cousin who had been turned away from a defense plant job despite having welding certifications, told that colored workers were not needed. Every round Coleman loaded, every target he helped engage, every kilometer Eleanor's revenge advance toward Berlin carried the weight of all those experiences. This was not just about defeating German military forces. This was about proving that African Americans deserved the rights and opportunities that the United States claimed to offer all citizens. This was about demonstrating that patriotism and courage were not the exclusive property of any single racial group. This was about forcing America to confront the contradiction between its stated ideals and its actual practices. And as Coleman watched German defensive positions through his periscope, he understood that the men defending those positions were about to receive an education in a truth that American racism had tried desperately to conceal, that black soldiers could fight with just as much skill, determination, and effectiveness as any troops in the world. The assault on the factory complex intensified as afternoon approached. American artillery had methodically reduced the most significant German strongpoints, and now the tanks were moving forward in coordinated rushes, each vehicle covering the advance of others, the supporting infantry following in disciplined formation. Cartwright's crew worked with the synchronized precision of a well-rehearsed machine, each man knowing his role, anticipating the needs of others, communicating with the abbreviated language that veterans develop after months of shared combat. Mitchell identified targets and called out range and deflection. Washington loaded rounds with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and precise. Jenkins guided the tank across uneven terrain, keeping the hull angled to present the most favorable armor to potential threats. Coleman monitored the radio traffic and maintained awareness of their tactical situation, ready to take over the hull machine gun if close defense became necessary. Oberst Steiner watched the American advance with growing recognition that his position was untenable. His forces lacked the ammunition for sustained resistance, lacked the anti-tank weapons necessary to deal with the Sherman tanks, lacked the air support that might have evened the odds, and increasingly lacked the will to continue fighting for objectives that seemed increasingly meaningless as the Reich collapsed around them. But beyond these tactical considerations, Steiner found himself wrestling with a more fundamental question. If the propaganda about black soldiers had been so completely wrong, what else had been lies? If these men advancing toward his position with such undeniable competence were everything that racial theory said they couldn't be, then what did that say about the ideology that had shaped German policy for years? Vogel approached his commander with a recommendation that they begin withdrawing to secondary positions before the American armor completed its encirclement. Steiner considered the suggestion, knowing that withdrawal was the only militarily sound option, but also recognizing that orders from higher command had explicitly forbidden any retreat without authorization. Those orders came from a leadership structure that was increasingly divorced from battlefield reality, that continued to demand impossible victories from forces that had been ground down to ineffectiveness, that maintained delusions about ultimate triumph even as Allied forces approached from all directions. Steiner had spent his entire career following orders, trusting in the judgment of superior officers, believing that discipline and duty were the foundation of military effectiveness. But standing in that ruined factory, watching black American soldiers demonstrate capabilities that he had been told were impossible, he found himself questioning whether obedience to orders that defied both military logic and observable reality was truly a virtue. The decision was made for him when a white phosphorus shell, likely fired from an American mortar position, impacted in the courtyard of the factory complex and began spreading its burning chemical load across defensive positions. White phosphorus was not being used to create casualties, but rather to mark targets for artillery and to create smoke screens that obscured German observation. It was a demonstration of the Americans' tactical sophistication, their ability to employ specialized munitions for specific purposes rather than relying solely on overwhelming firepower. As smoke began to fill the factory grounds, Steiner gave the order to begin a fighting withdrawal toward prepared positions 3 kilometers to the east, knowing that this retreat would likely be the first of many, that the American advance would not be stopped by anything his forces could accomplish, and that the conflict was entering its final phase. The withdrawal was conducted in good order, with disciplined squads falling back by sections while others provided covering fire. German training had always emphasized tactical competence at small unit levels, and even forces assembled from broken divisions could execute basic maneuvers with professional efficiency. But the Americans matched every German movement with appropriate countermeasures, pursuing but not overextending, applying pressure but not blundering into potential ambushes, maintaining contact while conserving their own forces. It was a level of tactical sophistication that impressed Steiner despite his growing despair about the strategic situation. As his forces fell back through the streets of Torgau's outskirts, Steiner noticed civilians watching from basement windows and damaged doorways. These were people who had lived through years of conflict, who had endured aerial bombardment and food shortages, and the constant anxiety of uncertainty about the future. Their expressions as they watched German soldiers retreating past their homes were complex. Fear about what American occupation would bring, relief that the fighting might soon end, exhaustion from years of hardship, and perhaps something approaching contempt for military forces that had promised victory, but now delivered nothing but continued destruction. Steiner wondered what these civilians thought about the black soldiers advancing into their city, whether propaganda had prepared them for this sight, whether their racial attitudes would survive contact with the reality of African American troops who behaved not as conquering barbarians, but as professional soldiers conducting military operations with discipline and restraint. That evening, as Steiner established a new command post in what had been a school building, he met with his remaining officers to assess their situation. The facts were grim. They had lost approximately 130 men during the day's fighting, killed, wounded, or simply vanished during the withdrawal. Their ammunition reserves were depleted by nearly 40%. They had no functioning radio contact with division headquarters and only sporadic communication with other units in the area. Intelligence suggested that American forces were advancing on multiple axes, not just toward Torgau, but toward Leipzig, Dresden, and all along the Elbe River line. Soviet forces were simultaneously approaching from the east, having already taken most of Berlin, and now pushing toward a link-up with Western forces. The Reich was being compressed into an ever-shrinking area, and there was no realistic prospect of reversing the military situation. But as Steiner listened to his officers report their unit's status, he kept returning to the question that had dominated his thoughts since morning. How had German intelligence been so completely wrong about American capabilities, and specifically about the combat effectiveness of black soldiers? This was not a trivial question of miscalculation. This was a fundamental misunderstanding of reality, a systematic error that seemed to originate from ideological assumptions rather than objective assessment. And if such basic errors could persist in military intelligence, what did that say about other aspects of German wartime policy? Lieutenant Ernst Bergmann, a platoon leader who had fought on the Eastern Front before being transferred west after recovering from wounds received at Kursk, offered his perspective during the officers' meeting. He noted that Soviet forces had included soldiers from dozens of different ethnic groups, Asians, Caucasus peoples, Central Asians, all fighting with various degrees of effectiveness. The German forces had not assumed these soldiers would be inherently inferior simply because of their ethnicity. They had assessed them based on their actual performance, their equipment, their training, their leadership. But with African American soldiers, there seemed to have been a predetermined conclusion that had nothing to do with objective military assessment and everything to do with racial ideology. Bergmann suggested, carefully because such observations were dangerous even as the Reich collapsed, that perhaps ideology had been allowed to trump reality in ways that had damaged German military effectiveness. The discussion was cut short by the arrival of a messenger from another unit, a young Gefreiter who had bicycled 20 kilometers through American-controlled territory to deliver a dispatch from what remained of divisional headquarters. The message confirmed what Steiner had suspected. The overall military situation was catastrophic. American and Soviet forces were expected to link up within days, cutting the remaining German-held territory in half. Orders from Berlin, to the extent that anyone in Berlin was still giving coherent orders, continued to demand resistance but offered no reinforcements, no supplies, and no realistic strategy for achieving anything beyond delaying the inevitable. The messenger, Gefreiter Klaus Hartmann, was 18 years old, had been conscripted 4 months earlier, and had received perhaps 6 weeks of actual training before being sent to a frontline unit. He sat in the school's former staff room, drinking ersatz coffee made from roasted grain and chicory, and spoke with the fatalistic acceptance of someone who had never believed the propaganda about final victory, and who just wanted to survive long enough to return home. Steiner asked Hartmann what he had seen during his journey through American lines. The young soldier described roads filled with military traffic moving eastward, supply columns that stretched for kilometers, mobile kitchens that provided hot meals to troops in the field, maintenance units that repaired damaged vehicles, with seemingly unlimited access to spare parts. He described seeing groups of prisoners being processed and transported to rear areas, treated correctly according to established conventions, given food and medical attention, and he confirmed what Steiner had observed. Many of the American soldiers, perhaps a third of those Hartmann had seen, were black men who conducted themselves as disciplined troops rather than the disorganized rabble that German propaganda had portrayed. April 24th brought rain, a cold, persistent drizzle that turned unpaved roads to mud and made visibility difficult beyond a few hundred meters. Steiner's forces maintained their positions in and around the school building, setting up what defensive works they could with the limited entrenching tools and materials available. The civilians of Torgau largely stayed in their homes, occasionally venturing out to search for food or water, but otherwise waiting to see what American occupation would bring. Church bells rang at midday, their sound mournful across the damaged cityscape, a reminder of peacetime routines that persisted even as the structures of normal life collapsed. The American advance resumed in the afternoon, more cautiously than the previous day due to reduced visibility, but still pressing forward with inexorable momentum. Cartwright's tank crew had spent the night in a farm complex 2 kilometers west of Torgau, taking turns on watch, while others slept in the tank or in an abandoned barn that still smelled faintly of livestock despite being empty of animals. They had eaten hot food brought forward by the battalion's support elements, the first hot meal in 3 days. Powdered eggs, canned bacon, toast made from packaged bread and real coffee, not the ersatz substitutes that German soldiers had to endure. The American military's logistics system was one of its greatest advantages, the ability to maintain supply lines across thousands of kilometers, to provide frontline troops with regular rations, to ensure that ammunition and fuel and spare parts reached units when needed. This logistical capability was not dramatic or headline-worthy, but it was fundamental to military effectiveness, and it was something that German forces had never been able to match. As Eleanor's Revenge moved through the rain-slicked streets of Torgau's outskirts, Cartwright maintained constant communication with his crew and with the other tanks in his platoon. The intercom crackled with position reports, target identifications, and the routine chatter that kept crews alert and coordinated. Mitchell called out a suspected defensive position in a building at the next intersection, and Cartwright ordered a precautionary round of high explosive to be fired at the upper floor. Washington loaded the round smoothly. The breech closed with its characteristic metallic snap. Mitchell laid the gun with practiced precision, and the 75mm cannon fired with a concussive force that momentarily dominated all other sounds. The shell impacted exactly where Mitchell had aimed it, and a section of the building's facade collapsed into the street below. No return fire came from the position, and the tank continued its advance. In the school building that served as German headquarters, Steiner listened to reports from forward observers describing the American advance. The pattern was consistent, probing movements followed by concentrated fire on any position that offered resistance, bypassing strong points that could be isolated, maintaining pressure without taking unnecessary casualties. It was the methodology of a military force that valued its soldiers' lives, that had the resources to employ firepower rather than manpower to solve tactical problems, and that was confident enough in its ultimate victory to avoid costly frontal assaults. Steiner had fought in the early campaigns when German forces had employed similar tactics, had seen how devastating a technologically superior force could be when properly employed. Now he was on the receiving end of that equation, and the experience was teaching him exactly how hopeless his situation had always been. Vogel entered the command post with a report that would change the tenor of the entire engagement. An American patrol had approached under a flag of truce, carried by a lieutenant who wished to speak with the German commander. This was not unusual in the final weeks of the European conflict, as American units often sought to arrange local surrenders rather than continuing costly fighting over objectives that had no strategic value. What was unusual was that the American lieutenant was a black officer, and he had come to offer terms for the German garrison's surrender. First Lieutenant Marcus Washington was 28 years old, a graduate of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, who had been commissioned in 1943 after completing officer candidate school at Fort Benning, Georgia. He was one of a small but growing number of black officers in the American military, men who had overcome not just the normal challenges of military training, but also the additional obstacles created by institutional racism and widespread assumptions about black soldiers' capabilities. Washington spoke fluent German, having studied the language at Tuskegee, and then refined his skills during months of interrogating prisoners and translating captured documents. He carried with him a white flag, and a determination to conduct the negotiation with absolute professionalism, knowing that every interaction with German forces was being observed and judged, that his performance would reflect on all black soldiers, and that he had to be better than perfect to be considered merely adequate. Steiner agreed to meet with the American officer, motivated partly by military pragmatism and partly by a curiosity he could not entirely suppress. The meeting took place in what had been the school's library, a room whose shelves still held some books, though many had been removed for use as fuel during the winter. Washington entered the room, saluted smartly despite being under a flag of truce, and introduced himself with formal correctness. Steiner returned the salute and invited the American officer to sit at a table that had once been used by students studying for examinations, but now served as a map table for military planning. The two men assessed each other across that table in a moment that carried significance far beyond its immediate tactical context. Steiner saw a black officer who carried himself with confidence and spoke German with educated fluency, whose uniform was clean and well-maintained, whose bearing suggested professional military training rather than the crude improvisation that propaganda had described. Washington saw a German colonel who appeared exhausted but retained a certain dignity, who seemed intelligent and thoughtful, who did not exhibit the fanatical ideology that characterized some German officers in the conflict's final stages. For a moment, both men recognized in each other something that transcended the immediate circumstances. Fellow professionals, trapped in a situation created by decisions neither of them had made, trying to conduct themselves honorably within the context of a dishonorable war. Washington laid out the terms of surrender with clarity and directness. The German garrison would lay down its weapons and assemble in a designated area. Officers would be allowed to retain their sidearms until processing was complete. Wounded would receive immediate medical attention from American medical personnel. All prisoners would be treated according to the Geneva Convention provisions regarding prisoners of conflict. No reprisals would be taken against civilians who had not actively resisted American forces. In return, the Americans expected complete cooperation, full disclosure of any mines or booby traps that had been emplaced, and assistance in locating any German personnel who might continue fighting after the official surrender. Steiner listened to these terms and asked the question that had been dominating his thoughts since the previous morning. He wanted to know about the black soldiers in American forces, their training, their combat record, their organizational structure. Washington understood immediately why Steiner was asking. He explained that the 761st Tank Battalion had been in continuous combat since November 1944, that they had participated in the relief of Bastogne during the Ardennes counteroffensive, that they had fought their way across the Rhine and through central Germany. He mentioned that General George Patton, not known for progressive views on race relations, had specifically commended the battalion for its performance, and had stated that he would be proud to have them in his command at any time. He noted that black soldiers served throughout the American military in various roles, from combat infantry to artillery to engineering units, and that their performance had consistently exceeded the expectations of officers who had initially doubted their capabilities. The conversation expanded beyond the immediate tactical situation into something more philosophical. Steiner, speaking carefully because he was still a German officer, and Washington was still an enemy combatant, expressed his growing recognition that much of what he had been told about racial hierarchies and military capability had been fundamentally incorrect. He noted that the professional competence of black American soldiers forced a reassessment of basic assumptions about human nature and human potential. Washington responded by pointing out that the same assumptions had been used to justify slavery, segregation, and discrimination throughout American history, that challenging those assumptions had been a constant struggle, and that black soldiers' performance in this conflict was providing evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. Steiner asked Washington what had motivated him to become a military officer, given the discrimination he must have faced. Washington's answer was complex and honest. He explained that he and other black Americans had chosen to serve for multiple reasons: patriotism, a belief that their country's founding principles were worth defending even when those principles were imperfectly applied; a desire to prove that African Americans deserved full citizenship rights, and a recognition that defeat of the Axis powers was necessary regardless of America's own shortcomings. He spoke about growing up in Alabama under Jim Crow laws, about the daily humiliations of segregation, about the lynchings that went unpunished, about the systematic denial of basic rights. And yet, he said, he still believed in the possibility of America living up to its stated ideals, and he believed that black soldiers' service in this conflict would make it harder for the country to continue denying those ideals application to all citizens. The two officers talked for nearly 2 hours, far longer than was necessary for negotiating a surrender. They discussed military history, tactical doctrine, the changes in warfare that this conflict had demonstrated. They talked about their lives before military service, Steiner's work as a civil engineer designing bridges in Bavaria, Washington's education at Tuskegee, and his hopes of becoming a teacher after the conflict ended. They acknowledged the strange intimacy of the moment, two men from completely different worlds finding common ground in their shared profession and their shared recognition that the ideologies that had driven the conflict were built on foundations that could not withstand honest examination. Eventually, Washington returned to the matter at hand. He needed an answer regarding the surrender terms. Steiner indicated that he would accept the terms, but needed to consult with his officers before making a final decision. Washington agreed to return in 2 hours for the formal surrender. As the American officer prepared to leave, Steiner asked one final question: what would happen to German prisoners, particularly given the racial theories that German propaganda had promoted and the treatment that black soldiers might feel was justified as retaliation. Washington's answer was firm and unambiguous. American military policy required proper treatment of all prisoners, regardless of their nationality or ideology, and black soldiers would adhere to those standards just as strictly as any other American troops. The purpose of this conflict, he said, was to defeat tyranny, not to replicate it. After Washington departed, Steiner assembled his officers to discuss the situation. The vote was not unanimous. There were some who argued for continuing resistance, but the majority recognized that further fighting would accomplish nothing beyond additional casualties and destruction. The military situation was hopeless, the Reich was collapsing, and surrender offered the best chance for their soldiers to survive the conflict and eventually return to their families. The decision was made to accept the American terms. The formal surrender took place at 1800 hours on April 24th in the courtyard of the school building. Approximately 700 German soldiers assembled under American supervision, laying down their weapons in organized piles while American troops maintained security. The process was conducted with professional efficiency and without incidents. German wounded were immediately transported to American medical facilities, where they received the same treatment as American casualties. Officers were separated for initial interrogation and processing, while enlisted personnel were organized into groups for transport to temporary holding areas. Cartwright's tank crew was present for the surrender, Eleanor's Revenge positioned to provide security during the proceedings. As Coleman watched German soldiers file past, laying down their weapons and forming into columns, he reflected on the historical significance of this moment. Black soldiers were not just participating in the defeat of German military forces, they were demonstrating, in the most undeniable way possible, that racial theories about inherent superiority or inferiority were lies. Every professionally executed operation, every successful engagement, every demonstration of military competence was evidence that human capability was not determined by skin color, that courage and intelligence and skill were universal human traits. Among the German prisoners, reactions to being supervised by black American soldiers varied widely. Some appeared indifferent, focused on the immediate relief of survival and the hope of eventually returning home. Others seemed confused or disturbed, struggling to reconcile what they were seeing with what propaganda had told them to expect. A few exhibited obvious hostility, the kind of deep-seated racism that would not be changed by mere evidence of competence. But many, especially the younger soldiers and those who had seen enough combat to develop respect for professional military performance, regardless of nationality, appeared to regard the black American soldiers with something approaching respect. the acknowledgement that these were men who had proven themselves in the most demanding test of all. Gefreiter Hartmann, the young messenger who had delivered dispatches the previous day, found himself in a processing line managed by an African-American sergeant who conducted the documentation with brisk efficiency. The sergeant, whose name tape read Williams, spoke some German and used it to explain the procedures, answering questions patiently and ensuring that everyone understood what was happening. Hartmann, who had never met a black person before being captured, found himself revising assumptions he had not even realized he held. This was not the caricature from propaganda posters. This was simply a professional soldier doing his job competently, treating prisoners with correctness, if not warmth, and demonstrating no particular malice or brutality. The processing continued through the evening and into the night, illuminated by portable lighting systems that the Americans had brought forward. The efficiency of the operation impressed even the German officers, who were accustomed to military logistics but had not seen anything to match American organizational capabilities in years. Food was provided to the prisoners, basic rations, but adequate and better than what many of them had eaten in recent weeks. Medical personnel moved through the groups, identifying anyone who needed treatment and ensuring that chronic conditions received attention. The entire operation demonstrated a level of care for enemy prisoners that contradicted the absolute warfare rhetoric that had characterized much of the conflict. Oberst Steiner spent his first night as a prisoner of conflict in a commandeered hotel in Torgau that American forces had converted into a temporary holding facility for German officers. The building still had running water, though no heat, and the beds had mattresses even if they lacked sheets. Steiner found himself sharing a room with 3 other German officers, including Major Wilhelm Koch, who had commanded an artillery battalion and who had been captured 3 days earlier during fighting near Leipzig. The 4 men talked through much of the night, processing their experiences and trying to understand the implications of what they had witnessed. Koch described his own surprise at the composition of American forces, particularly the presence of black soldiers in combat roles that German doctrine had insisted were beyond their capabilities. He recounted a conversation with an American military policeman, an African-American corporal from Detroit, who had explained the American military's segregation policies, while also noting the gradual changes that combat necessity was forcing. The corporal had mentioned that black soldiers were proving themselves in every role where they were given opportunity, that resistance from white officers was beginning to erode as evidence of competence accumulated, and that the conflict was likely to accelerate changes in American society that would have taken decades in peacetime. The discussion turned to broader questions about the ideological foundations that had shaped German policy during the past decade. If the racial theories regarding black soldiers had been so demonstrably false, what did that suggest about other aspects of racial ideology? If propaganda had lied about American military capabilities, what other lies had been told and believed? If the promises of final victory had been delusions, at what point had the outcome of the conflict become inevitable? These were dangerous questions for German officers to ask even in captivity, but the events of recent days had made them unavoidable. Steiner found himself thinking about the conversation with Lieutenant Washington, particularly the American officer's explanation of why black soldiers had chosen to serve despite facing discrimination in their own country. There was something admirable, even noble, about men who fought for ideals that their nation had not fully extended to them, who believed in principles strongly enough to defend them, even when personally excluded from their full benefits. It suggested a kind of patriotism that was more sophisticated than simple nationalism, a commitment to values rather than just territory or ethnic identity. And it raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of the ideals that German soldiers had been fighting for, ideals that seemed increasingly hollow as the reality of the regime's nature became impossible to ignore. The following days brought the rapid collapse of organized German resistance throughout central Germany. American and Soviet forces achieved their link-up at Torgau on April 25th, effectively cutting the remaining German-held territory in half. The images of American and Soviet soldiers meeting on the Elbe River, shaking hands and celebrating together, would become iconic representations of the Allied victory. Among those American soldiers were members of the 761st Tank Battalion, whose presence in these historic photographs documented the role that black soldiers had played in the defeat of German forces and in the liberation of Europe. For Steiner and the other prisoners, the days following surrender brought a gradual adjustment to captivity and a processing system that would eventually sort them according to rank, specialty, and potential war crimes involvement. The vast majority of German military personnel who surrendered to American forces in the conflict's final weeks were treated as prisoners of conflict under Geneva Convention provisions and were eventually repatriated to Germany, though sometimes only after months or years of captivity. The experience of being held by forces that included significant numbers of black soldiers continued to challenge German prisoners' preconceptions and to force recognition that propaganda had systematically misrepresented reality. Hauptmann Vogel found himself assigned to a work detail that involved clearing rubble from Torgau's streets under the supervision of an American engineering unit. The detail was commanded by a black lieutenant from Ohio, a civil engineer in civilian life who approached the task with professional efficiency and who treated the German prisoners with firm but fair supervision. Over the course of several weeks working on these projects, Vogel developed a grudging respect for the American officer's competence and for the way he managed both the German prisoners and his own men. It was impossible to maintain beliefs about racial inferiority when confronted daily with evidence that directly contradicted those beliefs. The broader historical significance of black soldiers' service in the conflict would take years to fully manifest. In the immediate aftermath of victory, American military began the slow process of demobilization and the even slower process of reconsidering its segregation policies. The performance of black soldiers in combat had provided evidence that could not be dismissed, had created a cadre of veterans who had proven their capabilities beyond any doubt, and had established a foundation for the arguments that would eventually lead to military integration and ultimately to broader civil rights advances. For German society, the recognition that propaganda about enemy forces had been systematically false would contribute to a broader reckoning with the lies they had been told and the crimes committed in their name. The sight of black American soldiers conducting themselves as professional troops, treating prisoners correctly, demonstrating competence in complex military operations, helped undermine the racial theories that had been central to the ideology of the regime. It was not the only factor in post-conflict German society's eventual rejection of racial ideology, but it was a significant one, a lived experience that contradicted propaganda in ways that could not be explained away. Sergeant Cartwright and his crew remained in Germany through the summer of 1945, participating in occupation duties and eventually in the early stages of reconstruction. They witnessed the discovery of concentration camps, the full revelation of the regime's genocidal policies, and the beginning of the process by which German society would confront the reality of what had been done in its name. For Cartwright and other black soldiers, there was a profound irony in helping to liberate victims of racial persecution while knowing that they would return to a country where they faced discrimination and segregation. That irony was not lost on them, and it would fuel their determination to fight for civil rights in the post-conflict years. The 761st Tank Battalion was deactivated in June 1946, and its personnel returned to civilian life, carrying with them the knowledge that they had proven themselves equal to any troops in the American military. They had fought through France and Germany, had participated in major operations, had received commendations from commanders who had initially doubted their capabilities and had demonstrated that courage and competence recognized no color line. Their service, along with that of other black military personnel during the conflict, would provide crucial evidence in the arguments that led to President Harry Truman's executive order integrating the American Armed Forces in 1948. For Private First Class Coleman, the return to Philadelphia after demobilization brought a determination to use his military experience as a platform for demanding change. He enrolled in college using benefits from the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, earned a degree in education, and became a teacher in Philadelphia's public schools. Throughout his life, he would speak to students about his experiences in the conflict, about what it meant to fight for a country that did not fully recognize his citizenship, about the responsibility to work for justice even when justice seemed distant. He would describe the moment when Eleanor's revenge rolled into Torgau, when German commanders who had believed propaganda about black soldiers' inferiority confronted the reality of African-American competence, and he would explain how that moment was part of a larger story about the slow, difficult, necessary work of dismantling racism and building a more just society. Lieutenant Washington remained in the military after the conflict, eventually rising to the rank of colonel and serving during the Korean conflict in an integrated army. He would later describe his meeting with Oberst Steiner as one of the most significant moments of his military career, not because of its tactical importance, but because of what it revealed about the power of direct experience to challenge ideology. He noted that no amount of propaganda could survive sustained contact with reality, that human beings were remarkably capable of revising their beliefs when confronted with undeniable evidence, and that the integration of American military forces demonstrated that institutions could change when forced to confront their own contradictions. Oberst Steiner spent 2 years in American captivity before being released and returning to Bavaria. He resumed his career as a civil engineer, contributing to Germany's reconstruction and never again serving in military capacity. In private conversations with family and friends, he would sometimes describe his experiences in the conflict's final days, particularly his encounters with black American soldiers whose competence had challenged everything he had been taught about race and capability. He became, in his quiet way, an advocate for rejecting the racial ideologies that had contributed to Germany's catastrophe, arguing that a society built on lies about human nature could not sustain itself and would ultimately collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The story of black soldiers in the Second World Conflict, particularly those who served in units like the 761st Tank Battalion, represents a crucial chapter in both military history and the broader narrative of civil rights. These men faced discrimination from their own country, skepticism from Allied forces, and propaganda from enemy forces, yet they performed their duties with skill and courage that could not be denied. Their service provided evidence that would prove crucial in the post-conflict struggle for equality, demonstrating that the barriers black Americans faced were products of racism rather than reflections of capability. The moment when German commanders like Steiner realized that black soldiers were leading the charge into Berlin was more than just a tactical surprise. It was a collision between ideology and reality, between propaganda and truth, between comfortable assumptions and uncomfortable facts. That collision forced recognition of a fundamental truth, that human potential is not determined by race, that courage and competence are universal human traits, and that systems built on racial hierarchies are built on foundations of sand that cannot support honest examination. The impact of black soldiers' service during the conflict extended far beyond the immediate military victories they helped achieve. Their performance provided evidence in debates about integration, their experiences informed civil rights activism, and their example inspired subsequent generations to challenge discrimination and demand equality. The integration of American military forces in 1948 was a direct result of the undeniable proof that black soldiers had provided during the conflict. That military integration, in turn, helped pave the way for broader civil rights advances in the 1950s and 60s. For the German soldiers who encountered black American troops in the conflict's final months, the experience forced a confrontation with the falsity of racial propaganda. Many German veterans would later describe this as a crucial moment in their own rejection of the ideology that had shaped the regime. When propaganda claims about enemy inferiority were so obviously contradicted by direct experience, it became impossible to maintain faith in other aspects of racial theory. The professional competence of black soldiers served as evidence that human capability transcended racial categories, that the hierarchies the regime had promoted were artificial constructs rather than natural facts. The tactical and operational performance of units like the 761st Tank Battalion demonstrated that when black soldiers were given proper training, equipment, and leadership opportunity, they performed as well as any troops in the American military, This was not a matter of exceptional individuals exceeding expectations. It was a matter of capable people performing at the level they had always been capable of achieving when given the opportunity. The fact that this seemed surprising to many observers reflected not the soldiers' limitations, but the limitations of a society that had systematically denied Black Americans opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities. The industrial and logistical superiority that enabled American victory in the conflict was built in part on the contributions of Black Americans in defense industries, in support roles, and in combat units. African American workers helped produce the tanks, ammunition, and supplies that equipped American forces. Black soldiers served in transportation, supply, and support units that maintained the logistics networks enabling sustained operations. And Black combat troops in infantry, armor, and artillery units directly contributed to tactical victories across multiple theaters. The American war effort was a collective endeavor that included contributions from all segments of American society, and the exclusion or marginalization of Black Americans would have significantly undermined that effort. The post-conflict period brought a gradual recognition of Black soldiers' contributions, though full acknowledgement took decades. Units like the 761st Tank Battalion received belated recognition for their service, with veterans being honored for achievements that had been understated or ignored during the conflict itself. Congressional medals, military commendations, and historical documentation gradually created a record that reflected the reality of Black soldiers' performance. This recognition was important not just for honoring individual veterans, but for establishing a historical truth that had been obscured by contemporary racism. The psychological impact of Black soldiers' service extended to the soldiers themselves and to the broader Black community. For the soldiers, proving themselves in the most demanding circumstances created a confidence and determination that would fuel post-conflict activism. Veterans who had demonstrated courage under fire, who had commanded tanks and led troops and made tactical decisions in combat, were not willing to accept second-class citizenship when they returned home. The military experience provided both practical leadership skills and a moral authority that would prove crucial in the civil rights movement. For the broader Black community, the service and achievements of Black soldiers during the conflict provided evidence of capabilities that racism had denied. Parents could point to these soldiers as examples for their children. Teachers could use their service to challenge racist assumptions, and activists could cite their performance as proof that segregation was unjustifiable. The conflict created a generation of Black veterans whose experiences directly contradicted the rationales used to justify discrimination, and those veterans became powerful advocates for change. The international dimension of Black soldiers' service also had significance. African American troops participated in the liberation of concentration camps, witnessed the consequences of racial ideology taken to its genocidal extreme, and helped establish the post-conflict order in Europe. Their presence in occupation forces, their participation in reconstruction efforts, and their interactions with European populations helped challenge international perceptions of American race relations, even as those interactions highlighted the contradictions between American ideals and American practices. The military integration that followed the conflict had profound implications for American society. An integrated military served as a laboratory for integration more broadly, demonstrating that Black and white Americans could work together effectively when institutions supported equality rather than segregation. The lessons learned from military integration informed approaches to school integration, workplace integration, and the broader civil rights struggle. While military integration did not solve all problems, it provided evidence that integration was feasible and beneficial, undermining arguments that segregation was necessary or natural. The story of Black soldiers in the conflict also illustrates the complexity of patriotism and the relationship between individuals and their nation. These were men who chose to serve a country that discriminated against them, who fought for ideals that were not fully extended to them, who risked their lives for a democracy that denied them full participation. Their decision to serve despite these contradictions reflected a sophisticated understanding of citizenship as both a set of rights and a set of responsibilities, a belief that the work of perfecting democracy required participation even from those who were excluded from its full benefits. The German commanders who witnessed black soldiers' performance faced a stark choice: to maintain ideological commitments in the face of contradictory evidence, or to revise their understanding based on observable reality. Many chose the latter, recognizing that what they had been told about racial hierarchies could not be reconciled with what they had seen on the battlefield. This revision of understanding was not necessarily accompanied by a full rejection of racism. Human beings are capable of holding contradictory beliefs and rationalizing evidence that challenges preferred narratives. But for many German soldiers and officers, the encounter with competent black troops planted seeds of doubt about racial ideology that would grow in the post-conflict years. The tactical situation in the conflict's final weeks created circumstances where black soldiers' contributions were particularly visible. As American forces raced toward link-up with Soviet troops, as resistance collapsed and German units surrendered en masse, as the regime's final days unfolded, black soldiers were present at every stage, participating fully in the operations that ended the European conflict. Their presence in these historic moments ensured that the photographic and documentary record of the conflict's conclusion would include images of African American soldiers, creating visual evidence of their participation that could not be erased or minimized. The humanitarian aspects of black soldiers' conduct during and after combat also challenged stereotypes. German prisoners who expected brutal treatment based on propaganda descriptions instead encountered soldiers who followed Geneva Convention provisions, who treated captives correctly, who distinguished between enemy combatants and civilians, medical personnel who treated wounded regardless of nationality, military police who maintained order without excessive force, and occupation forces who worked to restore basic services and civilian governance, all demonstrated that professional military conduct was not dependent on race. The technical complexity of armored warfare particularly refuted claims about black soldiers' capabilities. Operating a Sherman tank required mechanical knowledge, tactical understanding, crew coordination, and the ability to process multiple information streams simultaneously while making rapid decisions under stress. The fact that black tank crews performed these tasks as well as their white counterparts provided undeniable evidence of equal capability. Propaganda had claimed that black soldiers lacked the intelligence for complex operations. The performance of units like the 761st Tank Battalion proved that claim was false. The leadership demonstrated by black officers like Lieutenant Washington also challenged assumptions. Officers had to master not just tactical operations, but also personnel management, logistics, military law, and the administrative complexities of military organization. Black officers performed these duties successfully, earning the respect of both their own troops and, eventually, of many white officers who had initially doubted their capabilities. Each competent black officer provided evidence that leadership ability was not racially determined, that when given opportunity and training, black Americans could excel in positions of responsibility and authority. The post-conflict years would see ongoing struggle to ensure that black veterans received the benefits they had earned. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act provided educational and housing benefits that theoretically applied to all veterans, but discrimination in colleges, universities, and housing markets often prevented black veterans from accessing these benefits on equal terms with white veterans. Black veterans organizations worked to combat this discrimination, using veteran status as a platform for demanding equal treatment. The fact that these men had served their country in its time of greatest need provided moral authority that made it harder, though not impossible, for institutions to deny them opportunities. The memory of black soldiers' service during the conflict would be preserved through various means: veterans organizations, oral histories, museum exhibits, historical scholarship, and eventually films and documentaries. Each generation would rediscover these stories and find in them lessons relevant to contemporary struggles for equality and justice. The specific details might vary, the names and faces and individual stories, but the fundamental truth remained constant: that black Americans had proven themselves equal to any challenge, had demonstrated capabilities that racism claimed they did not possess, and had earned recognition and respect through their service and sacrifice. The intersection of military history and civil rights history in the story of black soldiers during the conflict reveals how seemingly separate narratives are actually deeply connected. Military performance during the conflict provided evidence used in civil rights arguments. Civil rights activism created pressure that influenced military integration. Integrated military forces provided models for civilian integration, and throughout this process, individual stories of courage, competence, and determination challenged and ultimately changed American society's understanding of race and capability. For historians studying the conflict's final months, the role of black soldiers in the advance toward Berlin represents an important corrective to narratives that minimize or ignore African American contributions. A complete understanding of how the conflict ended requires acknowledgement of who participated in that ending, and black soldiers were present in significant numbers throughout the final operations. Their absence from some historical accounts reflects the persistence of racism in historiography itself, the tendency to center white experiences and minimize or erase non-white contributions. Correcting this historiographical bias requires deliberate effort to recover and emphasize stories that were marginalized or ignored. The German commanders who surrendered to forces that included black soldiers faced a moment of reckoning with the consequences of ideology. The racial theories that had justified persecution, that had been used to categorize populations as superior or inferior, that had provided intellectual cover for genocide, were revealed as false by the simple fact of black soldiers' competence. This revelation did not necessarily create immediate conversion to anti-racism. Human beings are remarkably capable of maintaining contradictory beliefs and rationalizing evidence that challenges preferred narratives. But it created cracks in the ideological structure, moments of doubt that would grow over time, recognition that what one had been told and what one had observed could not both be true. The individual stories within this larger narrative each carry their own significance. Cartwright's determination to prove black soldiers' capability reflected the burden that African Americans carried, not just to succeed individually, but to represent their entire race. To know that their failures would be attributed to racial inferiority, while their successes would be dismissed as exceptions. Coleman's youth and idealism, tested by combat and discrimination, but maintained through determination to create change, represented the potential of a generation. Washington's combination of professional competence and articulate advocacy for equality demonstrated that black Americans could meet white society on its own terms and exceed its expectations. Steiner's journey from ideological certainty to doubt and eventual revision represented the possibility of change even among those who had been deeply invested in false beliefs. His recognition that he had been lied to about black soldiers' capabilities opened questions about what else he had been lied to about, creating a cascading series of revelations that would ultimately contribute to German society's post-conflict reckoning with its recent past. The fact that this change came through direct experience, rather than abstract argument, illustrated the power of lived reality to overcome propaganda. The broader lessons from this history extend beyond the specific context of the Second World Conflict. The story demonstrates that stereotypes and prejudices cannot survive sustained contact with contradictory evidence, that human beings are capable of revising even deeply held beliefs when confronted with undeniable reality, and that institutions can change when forced to confront their own contradictions. These lessons remain relevant in contemporary struggles against racism and discrimination, suggesting that integration, representation, and opportunity to demonstrate capability are crucial tools for combating prejudice. The sacrifice and service of black soldiers during the conflict created a moral debt that American society has struggled to repay. These men fought for a country that denied them full citizenship, defended democracy while excluded from its benefits, and proved their worth in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The fact that they had to prove their worth at all, that their capability was doubted and had to be demonstrated through extraordinary service, reflects the fundamental injustice of racism. The proper response to their service was not gratitude but recognition that the discrimination they faced had always been unjustifiable, that their rights as citizens should never have been conditional on military service, and that American society had failed to live up to its own stated principles. The integration of American military forces in 1948, the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, and the ongoing work to achieve racial equality all stand on the foundation that black soldiers helped build through their service during the conflict. Each advance toward equality honors their service, each step toward justice vindicates their sacrifice, and each recognition of black Americans' full humanity affirms the truth they demonstrated. That race does not determine capability, that courage and competence are universal human traits, and that societies built on racial hierarchies are built on lies that cannot withstand honest examination. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.